In the gilded cage of a Michelin star restaurant, where fortunes are made and reputations are shattered over a single glass of wine, a ghost in a starched apron moved between tables. Her name was Alara Vance, and she was a waitress. To the arrogant tech moguls she served, she was invisible, a nobody, an object of their casual cruelty. But hidden behind her tired eyes was a mind that once danced with the secrets of the cosmos. Tonight, a quiet billionaire sat in the corner, watching, and he was about to ask a question so complex, so specific, that it would expose every fraud in the room and ignite a forgotten brilliance no one saw coming. This is the story of how a single sentence changed everything. Ethelgard's was not merely a restaurant, it was a theater. Every night the same play was performed with a rotating cast of characters, all playing the role of important. The air, thick with the scent of truffle oil and ego, hummed with a low symphony of clinking silver and murmured stock tips. And through it all moved Alara Vance, a phantom of efficiency and deference. Her uniform was impeccable, a crisp black dress, a starched white apron tied just so. Her movements were economical, born of 1,000 nights spent navigating the treacherous geography of tables and chairs. A polite smile was fixed on her face, a mask of pleasant neutrality that betrayed nothing of the universe swirling behind her eyes. To the patrons of Ethelgard's, she was just the waitress, an interchangeable part of the restaurant's expensive machinery. They never noticed the way she'd sometimes pause by the grand arched window, her gaze lost in the pinpricks of light in the night sky, not seeing the city skyline, but the ghosts of constellations. They didn't see the faint, silvery scar that traced a delicate line above her right eyebrow, a memento from a laboratory accident involving a supercooled helium line. They didn't know that the hands that now refilled their glasses of Chateau Margaux once calibrated quantum spectrometers and penned equations that sought to unravel the very fabric of spacetime. 5 years ago, Alara Vance had not been a waitress. She had been Dr. Alara Vance, the most promising postdoctoral fellow at the Northwood Institute of Technology. Her specialty was theoretical astrophysics, specifically the analysis of anisotropies in the cosmic microwave background, CMB radiation, the faint afterglow of the Big Bang. She was a prodigy, a rising star whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and envy in academic circles. Her doctoral thesis, Non-Gaussian Signatures in Primordial Gravitational Fluctuations, was considered groundbreaking. It proposed a novel mathematical framework for detecting echoes of cosmic inflation, a theory that could revolutionize cosmology. Her mentor, the celebrated and charismatic Professor Eris Thorne, had called her his greatest discovery. He had nurtured her talent, championed her work, and provided her with access to the Institute's most powerful deep space telemetry data. She had trusted him implicitly. She had seen him as a father figure, the anchor in the lonely, demanding world of high-level academia. And then it had all come crashing down. The scandal had been swift and brutal. Professor Thorne published a paper in a leading scientific journal, a paper that was hailed as the breakthrough of the decade. It was her work, her framework, her equations, her data interpretation, all of it stolen and presented as his own. When she confronted him, he was cold, dismissive. When she tried to expose him to the university board, he was prepared. He produced falsified logs, doctored emails, and testimonials from colleagues he had swayed, all painting her as an unstable, ambitious subordinate who was trying to steal his glory. He used her passion, her obsessive dedication, against her, framing it as delusion. The academic world, a community built on reputation, closed ranks around its established star. Alara Vance, the brilliant prodigy, was recast as Alara Vance, the disgruntled fraud. Her funding was pulled, her name was tarnished, and her future was annihilated. Drowning in legal fees from a defamation lawsuit Thorne had slapped her with, and broken by the betrayal, she had vanished. She ran. She shed her identity like a snake shedding its skin. Dr. Vance died, and Alara the waitress was born. She took the job at Ethelgard's because it was anonymous. No one here would ever look at her and see anything more than a servant. The physical exhaustion of the work was a welcome anesthetic for a mind that used to race with the possibilities of the universe and now just replayed the tapes of its own destruction. Tonight was a Tuesday, typically a slower evening, but the main dining room was abuzz. Elora moved with practiced grace, delivering a plate of seared scallops to a hedge fund manager in his date. "Thank you, dear," the woman said without looking up from her phone. "My pleasure," Elora replied, her voice a soft, polite murmur. She retreated to her station near the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room, anticipating needs. A water glass needed refilling at table 7. Table 12 was ready for their check. It was a different kind of calculation than she was used to, a simpler algorithm of service and expectation, but she applied the same meticulous attention to detail. She had learned to find a strange, monastic peace in the routine. There was no ambition here, no hope, and therefore no room for the kind of devastating disappointment that had shattered her life. Here she was safe in her anonymity. Her past was a locked room, and she had thrown away the key, or so she believed. She had no idea that tonight, 2 sets of guests were about to arrive who would pick that lock and tear the door from its hinges. The first group arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, heralded by a wave of noise and expensive cologne that seemed to suck the refined air out of the room. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in their early 30s, all radiating the specific brand of aggressive confidence that comes from new money. The leader of the pack was Julian Croft. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a haircut that cost more than Elara's weekly earnings, and a designer suit that clung perfectly to his gym-tone frame. He was a venture capitalist who had made a fortune on a cryptocurrency app, and he carried himself as if he had personally invented the concept of currency itself. With him were Chad Mulligan and Tiffany Hayes. Chad was a beefy, loud-laughing sycophant whose primary role seemed to be agreeing with Julian. Tiffany, clad in a glittering cocktail dress, surveyed the restaurant with a look of bored appraisal, as if she were deciding whether it was worthy of her presence. "Croft, party of 3, Julian announced to the maitre d', not as a statement, but as a declaration of importance. They were seated at table 9, a prime spot in the center of the room. It was in Elara's section. A familiar, weary sigh settled in her chest. She had served their type 100 times before. They were a special breed of difficult, demanding, condescending, and utterly convinced that their net worth entitled them to treat service staff as subhuman. She approached the table, her smile firmly in place. "Good evening. My name is Elara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with some water?" Julian didn't even look at her. He was scrolling through his phone. "Voss, sparkling. 3 glasses, extra cold. And don't take all night." "Of course, sir," Elara said, her tone even. When she returned with the water, they were deep in a loud conversation about a new acquisition. Julian was boasting. "So I told them, a valuation under 500 million is an insult. We're not just disrupting the market. We are the market. These legacy dinosaurs don't get it. They just can't think on your level, Jay," Chad boomed, slapping the table for emphasis, making the silverware jump. Tiffany laughed, a shrill, unpleasant sound. "They're probably still using fax machines." Elara quietly placed the glasses on the table, her movements precise. As she leaned over to pour Julian's water, her sleeve cuff brushed against a fork, knocking it from the table. It landed on the plush carpet with a muffled clink. A tiny mistake, insignificant. But to Julian, it was an opportunity. He stopped talking and fixed her with a glare of pure disdain. "Seriously?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Can you not even manage to put a glass on a table without causing a mess? Do they just hire anyone off the street here?" Elara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, an involuntary reaction she despised. "My deepest apologies, sir. It won't happen again." She bent down to retrieve the fork, her hair falling across her face. "Don't just pick it up," Tiffany chimed in, wrinkling her nose as if Elara were handling toxic waste. "Get a fresh one, obviously." "Of course, madam," Elara said, straightening up. She took the fork and retreated toward the kitchen, her back ramrod straight. The eyes of the other diners felt like physical blows. They had all heard. She was, for a moment, the center of the restaurant's theater, cast in the role of the clumsy waitress. She returned with a polished fork on a small silver tray, placing it silently beside Julian's plate. "Are you ready to hear the specials, or would you like another moment?" she asked, her professional mask back in place. Julian waved a dismissive hand. We already know what we want. 3 fillets, medium rare, a bottle of the Chauvive Petrus, and see if the chef can do something about the pacing. We have important business to discuss. We don't have time to watch you drop things all night. The request for the 2005 Petrus, a wine that cost $12,000 a bottle, was delivered with the sole intention of broadcasting his wealth. Ilara simply nodded. An excellent choice, sir. I'll put that in right away. As she walked away, she heard Chad's booming whisper, perfectly calibrated to be heard. Guess you can't expect much from someone who peaked in high school? The words were a dull, familiar ache. They mocked the waitress, the woman standing before them. They had no idea they were mocking a mind that had once calculated the probable mass of primordial black holes. The irony was a bitter pill she had swallowed so many times it no longer had a taste. She locked the hurt away in that quiet room in her mind, next to the equations and the star charts, and focused on the simple, grounding task of retrieving a very expensive bottle of wine. 10 minutes after the Croft party had settled in, another guest arrived. He entered without fanfare, a man who seemed to be the physical antithesis of Julian Croft's boisterous energy. He was older, perhaps in his late 70s, with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes that held a deep, settled intelligence. He wore a simple, well-tailored but unassuming tweed jacket over a dark turtleneck. He didn't stride into the room. He seemed to drift, his presence quiet and unobtrusive. The maître d', however, straightened instantly, his professional demeanor sharpening into one of genuine, reverent respect. Mr. Finch, it is an honor to have you with us tonight. Your usual table is ready. The name meant nothing to most of the diners, but to a select few in the worlds of technology, physics, and high finance, it was legendary. This was Alistair Finch, not just a billionaire, but a titan, a man who had founded the world's most innovative aerospace and technology company, Finch Dynamics, decades ago. He had bankrolled projects that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, from deep-sea exploration to private spaceflight. He was a notorious recluse, rarely giving interviews or appearing in public. To see him here, alone on a Tuesday night, was like spotting a mythical creature in the wild. He gave the maître d' a small, gentle smile. Thank you, Robert. No fuss, please. His usual table was a discreet booth in the corner, offering a panoramic view of the dining room while affording its occupant a degree of privacy. It was also in Ilara's section. As she approached the booth, she felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Unlike the demanding energy radiating from Table 9, this man's presence was calm and centered. He was looking at a small, leather-bound notebook, making a notation with an old-fashioned fountain pen. "Good evening, sir," Ilara said softly. He looked up, and his eyes were startlingly clear and perceptive. He wasn't looking at her uniform. He was looking at her. For a disorienting second, she felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. "Good evening," he replied, his voice a gravelly but kind baritone. "No menu for me tonight, thank you. I'll have the sea bass and a glass of the Sancerre." "Of course, Mr. Finch," she said. She had served him a handful of times before. He was always polite, always quiet, and always tipped far more than was necessary. He was one of the few good tables, a brief respite in a sea of entitlement. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Young lady?" She paused. "Yes, sir." That was handled with remarkable grace. Ilara blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, sir." He gestured subtly with his head toward Table 9, where Julian was now loudly complaining to his companions about the quality of the breadsticks. The incident with the fork. It takes a great deal of strength to absorb rudeness and respond with professionalism, a rare quality. Ilara was speechless. No customer had ever acknowledged, let alone commented on, the silent indignities of her job. She felt that professional mask crack for a fraction of a second. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, a genuine warmth coloring her voice for the first time all night. "I appreciate that." He simply nodded and returned to his notebook. As the evening wore on, Alistair Finch ate his meal slowly, observing the room with a quiet, analytical gaze. He saw the way Tiffany sent back her steak, claiming it was closer to medium than medium rare. though Ilara knew it was cooked to perfection. He saw Chad snap his fingers to get Ilara's attention, a gesture of profound disrespect she bore with stoic patience. And he saw Julian Croft, holding court, his voice getting louder with every glass of the Petrus, ensuring the whole room knew he was celebrating a massive funding round for his new AI venture. Finch's gaze would occasionally settle on Ilara. He watched her movements, the precise way she cleared a table, the weary but determined set of her shoulders, the fleeting moments when her mask would slip and a deep, ancient sadness would cloud her eyes. He was a man who had built an empire by seeing what others missed: patterns in data, flaws in designs, potential in overlooked people. And as he watched the waitress and the loudmouth VC, he sensed a profound dissonance, a story far more complex than the one playing out on the surface. He didn't know what it was yet, but his curiosity, the driving force of his entire life, was piqued. He put down his pen, closed his notebook, and simply watched, waiting. The main courses had been served, and the volume from Julian Croft's table had reached a level that was beginning to fray the edges of Ethelgard's carefully cultivated ambiance. Julian, his face flushed from the expensive wine, was pontificating about his own genius. "The key," he said, gesturing grandly with his fork, "is not just having the idea, it's about having the guts to execute. Anyone can have an idea. It's the visionaries, the doers like us, who actually change the world. People who think, not people who carry plates for a living." He glanced directly at Ilara as he said the last part. She was standing a few feet away, discreetly refilling Chad's water glass. The comment was a direct hit, a poisoned dart aimed straight at her. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. Chad and Tiffany snickered into their napkins. Ilara finished pouring the water and turned to leave, but Julian wasn't done. He seemed to be feeding on his own cruelty. "Hey, waitress," he called out, his voice sharp. Ilara paused, her back to him. She took a slow, deep breath, schooling her features into a neutral mask before turning around. "Yes, sir?" "I've been thinking," he said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "What's your big dream in life? What grand ambitions does a person like you have? Hoping to get promoted to head waitress one day? Maybe open your own little greasy spoon?" It was a question designed not for an answer, but for humiliation. It was meant to highlight the chasm between his world and hers, to amuse his friends at her expense. The entire table was looking at her, their faces alight with malicious glee. Around them, nearby diners fell silent, pretending not to listen, but hanging on every word. Ilara's mind, a place she usually kept locked and guarded, was suddenly flooded. She saw a flash of herself at 25, standing before a packed auditorium, explaining the subtle temperature variations in the CMB map as if it were a beautiful, celestial poem. She felt the thrill of discovery, the pure, unadulterated joy of understanding something no human had ever understood before. She remembered her dream, to have her name etched alongside the greats, Einstein, Hubble, Sagan, not for fame, but for contributing one perfect, elegant piece to the infinite puzzle of the universe. And now this man, this shallow, arrogant creature, was asking about her dreams. The whiplash was so violent it almost took her breath away. For a moment, she was tempted to unleash the torrent of knowledge she kept dammed up inside her, to tell him that her ambition was to prove the existence of gravitational waves from the inflationary epoch, a concept his app-addled brain couldn't possibly comprehend. To tell him that the math scribbled on her dog-eared notebooks at home was more world-changing than his entire portfolio of holotech startups. But what would be the point? They would just call her crazy, they would laugh even harder, it would be a meaningless, self-destructive outburst. So she swallowed the truth. She swallowed the rage and the grief and the brilliant, burning light of who she used to be, and she gave him the only answer a waitress could give. "My dream, sir," she said, her voice impossibly calm, "is to make sure you have a pleasant dining experience." Her answer was so perfectly, devastatingly polite that it momentarily wrong-footed him. It was a verbal parry of such skill that it left him with no opening for a follow-up attack. Chad let out a nervous chuckle. Tiffany just looked confused. Julian narrowed his eyes, annoyed that she hadn't given him the emotional reaction he craved. He scoffed. Right. Well, you can start by getting us another bottle of this, he said, tapping the empty Petrus bottle. Chop, chop. My apologies, sir, Alara said, her voice still level. That was the last bottle of the 2005 vintage we had in the cellar. Julian's face darkened. What? Are you kidding me? This is Ethelgard's, not some suburban steakhouse. Go check again. I am quite certain, sir. I checked the inventory myself this afternoon. I could, however, recommend the 2009 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. It's an exceptional alternative. Don't recommend things to me, he snapped. Your job is to bring me what I ask for. Unbelievable. This whole evening is a disaster. He slumped back in his chair, fuming, deprived of his second trophy bottle. Ilara gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and retreated, her composure a shield of unbreakable ice. But in the corner booth, Alistair Finch saw it all. He saw the flash of fire in her eyes when Julian asked about her dreams. He saw the monumental effort it took for her to rein it in, and he heard her flawlessly polite, soul-crushing answer. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of brilliant scientists forced into corporate jobs, of artists who had to give up their passion to survive. It was the look of a caged eagle, and Alistair Finch had a lifelong habit of opening cages. He picked up his water glass, a thoughtful, calculating look on his face. The play was nearing its climax. It was almost time for him to step onto the stage. Julian Croft, having been denied his wine, needed a new way to reassert his dominance. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the quiet, unassuming figure in the corner booth. He recognized Alistair Finch. Not from television, but from a single, highly exclusive tech summit he'd attended the year before. The realization dawned on him with the force of a thunderclap. This was his chance. Impressing Alistair Finch would be an infinitely greater coup than ordering a second bottle of expensive wine. He leaned across the table, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. Don't look now, he said to Chad and Tiffany, but that's Alistair Finch. Chad's jaw dropped. The Alistair Finch? From Finch Dynamics? The one and only, Julian said, a predatory gleam in his eye. This is perfect. His Finch Horizon Fund is exactly what we need for our Series B funding. I need to get over there. Ignoring Tiffany's half-hearted Julian, don't. He stood up, straightened his suit, and strode towards Finch's table with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Ilara watched from her station, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. It felt like watching two weather fronts about to collide. Mr. Finch, sir, Julian began, his voice oozing a sycophantic charm that was completely at odds with his behavior moments before. Julian Croft, CEO of ConnectSphere. We met briefly at the Aspen Summit last year. It's an absolute honor. Alistair Finch looked up from his notebook, his expression unreadable. Mr. Croft, he said, his tone neutral. I remember. Julian beamed, taking this as an invitation. My team and I are celebrating our latest funding round. We're developing a predictive AI algorithm that's going to revolutionize social metrics. It's a real paradigm shift. He launched into a torrent of buzzwords: synergy, scalability, blockchain integration, hyper-targeted engagement, a verbal smokescreen designed to sound impressive without saying anything of substance. Finch listened patiently, his head tilted slightly. When Julian finally paused for breath, Finch didn't comment on his pitch. Instead, he changed the subject completely. You're a man of big ideas, Mr. Croft, Finch said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. You talk of paradigms, so let's talk about a real one, the one that created everything. Julian looked confused. Sir? Cosmology, Finch stated simply. The ultimate big picture. My company is funding a new deep space radio telescope, and we've run into a fascinating theoretical problem. I'm sure a mind like yours can appreciate the complexity. He leaned forward slightly. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Julian, Chad, and Tiffany were now standing by the table, utterly captivated. This was the test. Let's talk about the cosmic microwave background, Finch continued, his eyes twinkling. Specifically about the statistical anisotropies in the WMAP 7-year dataset. There was a notable anomaly, a trispectral non-Gaussianity, found in the sector aligned with the Draco constellation. Most models attribute it to instrumental noise or foreground contamination from synchrotron radiation. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Julian, then Chad, then Tiffany. Their confident smiles had frozen, replaced by looks of utter, blank confusion. They didn't understand a single word. But a few theorists proposed a more exotic cause, Finch said, his voice dropping slightly. They suggested it was evidence of a cosmic string collision during the inflationary epoch. A very bold claim. So my question for you, Mr. Croft, a man of vision, is this? He leaned in, and the question fell into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. What was the specific mathematical signature, the unique topological defect, that Dr. Alara Vance's 2019 paper proposed would differentiate the spectral index of such a collision from the background noise of standard quantum fluctuations? Silence. It was not just silence. It was a vacuum. The question was so absurdly, impossibly specific that it seemed like a prank. It was a query from another universe, a language they did not speak. Julian Croft's face, which had been a mask of smug confidence, collapsed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked to Chad for help, but Chad was staring at the floor as if hoping it would swallow him. Tiffany was examining her fingernails with intense interest. Julian stammered, his mind whirring, trying to find a foothold. That's a very technical question. My expertise is more in the application of AI, not the theoretical side of. I see, Finch said softly, the words carrying no judgment, yet delivering a verdict more final than any insult. The air crackled with Julian's humiliation. He had been exposed, his intellectual posturing revealed as utterly hollow in the face of genuine, profound knowledge. He was a fraud, and in a single surgical question, Alistair Finch had proven it to everyone. The old billionaire leaned back, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had known they wouldn't have the answer. He had asked the question for another reason entirely. His eyes left the humiliated tech bros and scanned the room, searching. They came to rest on the waitress, who was standing by her station, frozen, her face as white as her apron. Time seemed to slow down. For Ilara, the world had compressed into a single, roaring point of pressure. He had said her name. Alistair Finch, a man she had only ever read about in science journals as a patron saint of pure research, had asked a question about her work, her unpublished, stolen, and discredited work. The room was a blur, the faces of the diners, the glint of the chandeliers, the low hum of conversation. It all faded into a muted background buzz. All she could hear was the question, echoing in her mind. It wasn't just a question, it was a key to the locked room where she had hidden her former self. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A war raged within her. One part of her screamed to stay silent, to remain the invisible waitress. Answering would mean exposing herself, inviting the ridicule and disbelief all over again. It would mean reopening a wound she had fought for 5 years to scar over. To be Alara Vance again was to be a target. But another part, a part she thought had died long ago, stirred. It was the scientist, the seeker of truth, the woman who had spent countless sleepless nights fueled by coffee and sheer passion, chasing the echoes of creation. And that part of her bristled at the idea of her work being discussed, even in a hypothetical question, and not being defended, not being explained with the precision it deserved. It was an insult to the work itself. She saw the blank, idiotic stare on Julian Croft's face. She saw the smug superiority he had worn all night curdle into pathetic confusion. And in that moment, the fear was eclipsed by a cold, burning anger. He and his kind had judged her, mocked her, and dismissed her as nothing. They lived in a shallow world of money and status, while she had walked in a universe of breathtaking complexity and beauty. She took one step forward, then another. Her shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. Every eye in the room turned to her as she approached the two tables. Julian Croft looked at her with irritation, as if to say, "What does she want now?" She stopped, standing between the two men, the humiliated peacock and the quiet eagle. She looked directly at Alistair Finch. Her voice, when it came out, was not the soft, deferential murmur of a waitress. It was clear, steady, and resonant with an authority that had been dormant for half a decade. "He's referencing my doctoral thesis," she began, the words tasting strange and familiar on her tongue. "Not a published paper. It was never published." A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. Julian Croft's jaw literally dropped. "What did you say?" Elara ignored him, her entire focus on Finch. "The common misconception in models of cosmic string collisions is that they would produce a simple line-like discontinuity in the CMB's temperature map. But that fails to account for the oscillation decay of the string segment post-collision." She took a breath and the years of forced silence fell away. The equations and concepts bloomed in her mind, as clear and vibrant as ever. "My thesis proposed that the signature wouldn't be a simple line. It would be a series of frequency-dependent, oscillating temperature gradients. The key differentiator, the unique mathematical signature you asked about, is a phenomenon I termed cascading harmonic birefringence. The gravitational waves emitted by the decaying string would polarize the CMB photons in a very specific, spiraling pattern. It wouldn't present as a simple change in the spectral index, but as a curl-type anomaly in the B-mode polarization field. It would look less like a scar and more like a faint celestial fingerprint spinning in place. She spoke with a fluid, effortless brilliance. The jargon that had baffled Julian Croft flowed from her as if it were her native language. It was a performance of pure, unadulterated intellect. When she finished, a profound silence held the room in its grip. No one moved, no one breathed. They had all just witnessed a transformation. The clumsy waitress had vanished, and in her place stood a titan. Julian Croft stared at her, his face a comical mask of disbelief and horror. He was starting to understand the catastrophic scale of his misjudgment. Alistair Finch's face, which had been impassive, slowly broke into a wide, genuine smile. It reached his eyes, which shone with delight and vindication. He had thrown a line into the dark, hoping to catch something extraordinary, and he had pulled up a star. He looked at her, his voice full of a deep, resonant respect. "Dr. Elara Vance," he said, the title landing in the silent room with the force of a gavel. "I was beginning to think you didn't exist anymore. I've been looking for you for a very long time." The use of her title, doctor, was not merely a word, it was a resurrection. It sliced through 5 years of accumulated shame and anonymity, shattering the persona of Elara the waitress into a million irrelevant pieces. In the ringing silence that followed, Dr. Elara Vance drew her first breath. The air in the restaurant suddenly seemed charged with a new kind of energy, and the gilded room, which had been her prison, was instantly transformed into the theater of her rebirth. The shock on the faces around her was a sight to behold. Julian Croft, moments before the apex predator of this ecosystem, now looked like a ghost, his face a pallid mask of horror and dawning comprehension. Tiffany and Chad, his erstwhile acolytes, had subtly distanced themselves from him, their expressions a mixture of fear and secondhand humiliation. They were staring at Elara as if she had just shed her skin and revealed a being of fire and light. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elara didn't care about their stares. She didn't shrink from them or feel the familiar, hot flush of embarrassment. She met their gazes one by one with a calm, level intensity that made them look away. Her entire being was focused on the man in the corner booth, the quiet observer who had just recalibrated her entire universe. "How?" she began, her voice a trembling whisper, the sheer emotional whiplash of the moment threatening to overwhelm her. "How did you know about my thesis? It was sealed by the university. It never saw the light of day." Alistair Finch's smile was one of profound satisfaction, the look of a grandmaster whose complex, multi-move strategy had just resulted in checkmate. "I fund the grant that sponsored your project at Northwood," he explained, his voice calm and steady, a lighthouse in her swirling sea of emotions. "The Finch Endowment for Theoretical Cosmology. I'm not a passive benefactor, Dr. Vance. I don't just write checks. My passion, my one true indulgence, is knowledge. I make it a point to read the preliminary work of all the minds my money supports. Your doctoral thesis, it wasn't just good, it was a symphony. It was the most brilliant, elegant, and audacious piece of theoretical physics I had read in 3 decades. He paused, his gaze flicking with surgical disdain toward Julian Croft. And then, 6 months after your project was terminated, I read Professor Eris Thorne's celebrated paper in the Astrophysical Journal. It was a clumsy, brutish plagiarism of your work. He had your conclusions, your final equations, but he lacked the foundational elegance. He presented your findings as a destination, but he couldn't replicate the genius of the journey. To a layman, he said, his eyes settling on Julian with cold finality, it was revolutionary. To me, it was a forgery, a cheap knockoff of a masterpiece. I knew instantly that it wasn't his. Ilara felt a sob catch in her throat. It was a sound of 5 years of suppressed validation fighting its way to the surface. Someone had known. All this time while she was scrubbing wine stains and memorizing specials, someone of consequence had seen the truth and had been indignant on her behalf. I immediately began making inquiries, Finch continued, his voice a low, powerful rumble of righteous anger. And I ran into a wall of academic cowardice. The university protected their star professor, their rainmaker. They valued their reputation more than the truth. They sealed your records and painted you as unstable. And you had disappeared, vanished without a trace. It was the final damning piece of the puzzle for me. An innocent person, a scientist on the verge of a Nobel-worthy discovery, does not simply vanish. A guilty person, or in this case, the victim of one, does. He gestured with a gentle, respectful hand to the empty chair in his booth. Please, doctor, sit with me. Your shift is over. As if in a dream, Ilara moved to his table. She untied the strings of her starched white apron, that symbol of her servitude and anonymity, and let it fall from her waist onto the empty chair of a nearby table. The simple act felt momentous, a shedding of a skin she had worn for far too long. She sat down opposite Alistair Finch, her back straight, her posture no longer that of a deferential waitress, but of a respected academic peer. Finch then turned his attention back to Julian Croft, and the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial coldness. Mr. Croft, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute power, you came to my table seeking capital from my venture fund. You speak of vision, of changing the world. Yet you have demonstrated tonight a catastrophic failure of perception. You were in the presence of true world-altering brilliance, and all you could see was a servant to mock. You value bluster over substance. You mistake arrogance for intellect. You are a child playing with shiny toys in the shadow of a giant. Finch Dynamics, and I personally, have no interest in funding a company led by a man with such a profound poverty of character. Our conversation, and any possibility of a future one, is over. I suggest you and your associates settle your bill and leave. Every word was a perfectly executed public vivisection. Julian Croft's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Rage, denial, panic, and finally a hollow, defeated emptiness. He had flown too close to the sun, and his wax wings had not just melted, they had evaporated. He turned speechless, his social and perhaps financial ruin sealed in a single monologue. He looked at Tiffany and Chad for support, but they were already inching away, their faces pale, desperate to escape the blast radius of his spectacular self-destruction. Without another word, the trio turned and fled the restaurant, a palpable cloud of shame and failure trailing them out the door. The moment they were gone, the muted tension in the room broke. An older man at a nearby table, a distinguished-looking gentleman with a silver beard, began to applaud, slowly and deliberately. His wife joined in. Soon a ripple of applause spread through the dining room, a quiet, respectful ovation for the woman who had been their waitress moments before. The maître d', Robert, who had watched the entire exchange with a look of growing horror and awe, hurried over. His face was a study in profound apology. He held a single unopened bottle. It was a 1990 Cristal. Dr. Vance, he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. I am so deeply sorry. I had no idea. Please, this is on the house. For you and for Mr. Finch. We, we are honored to have been a part of this." Elara, overwhelmed, simply nodded, a watery smile on her face. "It's all right, Robert. Thank you. How could you have known?" Alistair Finch waited patiently until Robert had poured 2 glasses of the champagne and retreated. He pushed one of the crystal flutes towards Elara. "This was not just a chance encounter, Dr. Vance," he said, picking up the thread of their conversation. "My finding you here tonight was not an accident. I have had a team of the best private investigators in the country searching for you for over a year. It was a difficult task. You did an admirable job of erasing yourself. We found you 6 weeks ago, working here. I admit I was astonished, but I refused to simply approach you out of the blue. I couldn't risk you running again. I needed to understand the situation, and I needed to give you the opportunity to reclaim your own voice. So I've been dining here every Tuesday, watching and waiting for the right moment, a moment where the contrast between who you are and the role you've been forced to play was so stark, so undeniable, that it would have to break." He slid his small, leather-bound notebook across the polished wood table. It fell open to a page filled with diagrams and calculations that made Elara's heart ache with a familiar longing. "This notebook," he said, "is filled with my thoughts on your thesis, questions I wanted to ask you, ideas for expanding on your framework. But it is also a placeholder for a formal offer. I am not just a benefactor, Dr. Vance. I am a builder. I am in the final stages of establishing a new, private research division within Finch Dynamics. We are calling it the Alistair Finch Institute for Advanced Cosmology. It is located on a mountaintop adjacent to our new radio telescope array in the Atacama Desert in Chile, far from the politics and pettiness of university boards. It will have a virtually unlimited operational budget, a hand-picked team of the brightest minds we can find, and one singular mission: to pursue pure knowledge without the burden of bureaucracy or the need to publish for tenure. I want you to be its inaugural director." Elara stared at him, her mind struggling to encompass the sheer scale of what he was offering. It wasn't just a job. It wasn't just a research grant. It was a kingdom, a scientific paradise built to her specifications. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, magnified 1,000 times over. A flicker of the old fear, the ghost of her trauma, surfaced. "But a Thorne," she whispered, the name tasting like ash. "He is a powerful man. He has friends, influence. The moment I resurface, he will try to destroy me all over again." Alistair Finch allowed himself a thin, dangerous smile. It was the smile of a man who had never lost a fight he truly cared about. "Professor Thorne is finding out right now that his influence is a flickering candle in the face of a hurricane. As we sit here, my legal team is serving him with a civil suit for academic fraud, intellectual property theft, and tortious interference with your career. We are suing him and the university as a complicit party for damages that will make their eyes water." He leaned forward, his voice dropping with conspiratorial satisfaction. "Furthermore, the bribed lab assistant, you might remember, a young man named Dr. Peterson? He has been consumed by guilt for 5 years. It didn't take much persuasion from my investigators for him to provide a sworn affidavit detailing how Thorne coerced him into falsifying lab schedules and data logs. We have the university's server records, recovered by a cybersecurity expert, which prove Thorne accessed and downloaded your entire thesis from your terminal 2 days after you were officially locked out of the system. We have him, Dr. Vance, cold. His career is not just over. It will be a cautionary tale taught in ethics seminars for generations. What I am offering you is not just a job. It is restitution. It is justice. It is the public, unequivocal, and permanent restoration of your name, your work, and your future." The final wall of her fear crumbled, washed away by a tidal wave of vindication. The tears that had been welling in her eyes finally broke free, streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness or pain, but of a profound, cleansing release. She was free. She looked from the open notebook, filled with the beautiful language of mathematics, to the kind, brilliant, and fiercely loyal eyes of the man who had become her unlikely savior. She looked past him, through the grand window of the restaurant, at the night sky. The city lights were bright, but for the first time in years, she could see the stars behind them. They were not distant, mocking reminders of a life she had lost. They were an open invitation, a homecoming. The universe was calling her back. Finch pushed his old-fashioned fountain pen across the table. It was a heavy, magnificent instrument of dark wood and polished silver. "There will be contracts, of course, legions of them," he said with a wry smile. "But for tonight, let this be a gesture, a promise." Ilara picked up the pen. Its weight felt solid, significant, and wonderfully familiar in her hand. It was an instrument of creation, not of service. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, she turned to a blank page in Alistair Finch's notebook. She didn't sign her name. Instead, with the fluid grace of long, suppressed genius, she wrote out the core equation of her thesis, the beautiful, complex formula for calculating cascading, harmonic birefringence. Below it, she finally signed, not just her name, but her reclamation, Dr. Ilara Vance. She pushed the notebook back to him. Alistair Finch looked down at the equation, then at her signature, and his smile was one of pure, unadulterated joy. The joy of a discoverer who had found a lost world. "Welcome back, Doctor," he said softly. "You have been missed." Ilara Vance's story is a powerful reminder that true worth is not defined by a uniform, a job title, or the cruel judgments of others. It is a light that burns within, and no amount of darkness can extinguish it forever. She went from being invisible to being invincible, not because of a miracle, but because she held on to the one thing no one could take from her, her brilliant mind. Her journey from a starched apron back to the stars proves that intellect, dignity, and quiet strength are the most powerful forces in any room. We all have hidden depths, talents, and pasts that the world doesn't see. The question is, when our moment comes, will we be brave enough to answer the call? If this story of justice and redemption resonated with you, if you believe in the power of hidden potential, then please help us share it. Hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that prove true worth can never be hidden for long. Thank you for listening.